Today I want to talk about the relationship between science and religion. Many of you probably have a sort of a fixed image of your head of Galileo being persecuted for his belief that the sun was not at the center of the universe, and the Catholic Church opposed to him. And so this sets up this idea, which is quite common, that science and religion are diametrically opposed. And there is some truth to that, but I also want to investigate that claim a little bit more in depth. Okay, first let me talk about the idea that they are diametrically opposed. One of the defining features of what historians call the modern era, typically the modern era is something that emerges beginning with a combination of political revolution, French and American revolutions, an industrial revolution, which begins in Great Britain and then spreads to other parts of Europe, into the United States, and then subsequently to the rest of the world. But the byproduct of political, technological, industrial, and scientific revolution, all these things combined, is to produce a modern way of thinking. And we historians call this modernity. It's the kind of buzzword that we use. Associated with modernity is the idea that religious explanations can no longer be taken for granted. People still might explain the world in religious terms, but we can no longer take them for granted because we have alternative ways to explain the world using the scientific method, using reason, using various kinds of scientific instruments that can help us to measure the world and to document it in ways that religion can't do. And for many people, the scientific way of understanding should actually supplant and replace the religious way of understanding. And by the way, during the Enlightenment, this is the period in the mid-1700s, centered in France, but also elsewhere throughout Europe, there were many figures in the Enlightenment, famous people such as Voltaire, who believed that religious ways of explanation were no longer valid, that all explanations had to be rational and scientific. Okay. So this is the contrast between the scientific and the religious point of view. Very often we see these two things as diametrically opposed. We have those who believe that the theory of evolution explains the origins of human beings, but somehow there are others who believe that this cuts God out of the equation, so we need a view of the origins of human beings that allows a place for God's miraculous creation of us. And scientific explanations can't be compatible with that. Okay, now I want to complicate this tension between science and religion a little bit. I think this is one of the fallacies of the study of the history of science and technology, is that science is opposed to religion. In fact, many of the early pioneers, the big figures in the history of science, were very religious, quite religious. Newton, at the same time that he was studying the celestial mechanics, also was a devoutly religious individual. And this was true of many other of the major figures of the scientific revolution, including one person I already mentioned, Galileo. There were many in the church, by the way, who supported Galileo, just as there were many who did not support Galileo, and very often their support for him had nothing to do with their rejection of his science. It had more to do with the fact that he stepped on some toes and was quite impolitic in dealing with other people within the Catholic Church. That had he conducted himself in a different way, many people would have been absolutely fine with his science. And by the way, the Catholic Church has for quite a long time recognized that Galileo was correct. St. Augustine, one of the great figures in the religious tradition, said that there are two ways to get to know God. One way is to study the Word, the Bible. The other way is to study God's creation. Many of the individuals who initiated the scientific revolution, including, again, Newton, believed that in studying the world, using their own wits, using reason, which God had endowed us with, they would be glorifying God. That in unpacking the mechanisms that run God's creation, we would get ourselves closer to God. And in this sense, there isn't an opposition between a religious point of view and a scientific point of view. That science is actually a vehicle for understanding God's creation. Now, I say this just to complicate your conceptions perhaps a little bit, that science and religion are diametrically opposed. They do not have to be. Now, it's true. At a certain point, many people began investigating the world to glorify God, to understand God's creation, and in the process, they realized they didn't need God. They could understand the world using their own wits without reference to the Bible, without reference to any kind of religious tradition, and in this sense, indeed, science could pave the way for people transforming themselves into their own kinds of gods. That we can explain the world on our own as if we are gods. And furthermore, because we can use the knowledge of the world that we have derived to transform that world, we also have transformed ourselves into things with godlike powers. I'll discuss this later on with regard to a topic I referred to as the Promethean spirit. But just for now, let me just suggest that on the one hand, science and religion, yes, they are diametrically opposed, and that scientific explanations very often are incompatible with religious ones. But on the other hand, they're also compatible. Many people believe that you could get to know God through studying the natural world and God's creation.